We are reconvening our meeting and continuing to discuss S-259, and our next witness is Lauren Hurl.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today in strong support of S-259, a bill to create a climate superfund and hold large fossil fuel extracting and refining companies accountable for helping pay for the damage their activities and products are causing in Vermont. My name is Lauren Hurl, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters. VCV is a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advocates for strong environmental policies and educates voters using tools like our environmental scorecard. And one of our annual projects is the Environmental Common Agenda, which we provided to you all in January. And in this, we work with a range of environmental organizations. This year, 19 organizations participated. And we identify our key legislative priorities, and S-259, the bill we're discussing today, was identified as a top priority for the environmental community this year. And first and foremost, I want to underscore that the costs of climate change are being borne by Vermonters right now. And this bill simply asks the largest fossil fuel extraction and refining companies who put these products on the market, all while knowing that they would result in damage to our communities, to help pay for these costs. To give you some examples of what these costs look like, in addition to wearing my VCV hat today, I'm also a Montpelier City Councilor. And with last summer's climate change driven extreme rainfall, I've seen firsthand how our city finances were decimated. This was due to lost revenue from our local options tax, from our businesses that were shuttered for months. Our parking fund was zeroed out for months. We had numerous tax abatements for flood impacted properties. We also had direct impacts and costs, including massive flood damage at City Hall. At a council meeting tonight, we're going to be looking at proposals to rebuild, and they range from kind of rebuild cheaply and get it back up and running to try to make it more resilient, moving utilities up higher. And because our finances are so decimated, I really don't know where we're going to head. And it's going to be, ridiculous to have to rebuild in a less smart way. But with the financial situation that we're in, I don't know which direction the council is going to go. In addition to rebuilding City Hall, we need to make our fire station more resilient to future floods, which we know are nearly certain to occur on the overheated planet we now have. Or we need to decide if we want to rebuild a new fire station for many millions of dollars out of the flood zone and hope that it will remain out of the flood zone. We also know we need to take steps to protect our wastewater treatment facility, which almost flooded in July and is likely to face future flooding in a changed climate. We need to upgrade our stormwater system to handle the heavier volumes of rain that climate change is bringing. We're seeing notable increases in water main breaks, which cost money and time to fix and result in boil water notices for our community members. So they can't drink the water out of the taps, one of the most basic functions government can provide our residents, the essential water we're having more and more difficulty actually providing. The climate science is very clear. In a warmer world, flooding is anticipated to be more common and more severe in the coming years. Communities like mine and those you represent are facing numerous decisions and investment challenges as we grapple with how the climate has already changed and will continue to change, in large part thanks to the burning of fossil fuels. And we're massively under-resourced as we try to take on these challenging issues alone, community by community. We're getting some reimbursement from the federal and state government, but we will not be made whole as a community. And those funding sources are, of course, coming from taxpayers. Our local business community, and I know you've heard a lot of this, but just to put it all together as we just think about what are the real impacts on the ground for a climate disaster impacted community. Our local business community in town has been incredibly resilient. I think if you walk downtown right now, it can be easy to forget because they did such an amazing job rebuilding. But if you were here at all last summer, it was a ghost town. There was a sickening chemical-laced smell from the muck and mud that soaked our town. It was heartbreaking to walk down and see the entire contents of all these small businesses that had lovingly curated their inventories for years just out on the street, destroyed. They had already been hammered by the pandemic and now are facing this other massive hit. And to reopen, many, and probably most of them, have had to take on large new loans. So while it looks really kind of resilient downtown, the trauma and financial hits are severe and ongoing. Our local homeowners were also impacted. There are people who lost their homes altogether. We have already, as a town, approved several buyouts, meaning the people who were living there lost their home. This is exacerbating our housing shortage. It also means that These neighbors of ours often can't stay here because there's nowhere for them to go. Those houses will be torn down, reducing our housing stock and taking those properties permanently off of our tax rolls. There are still people living in shells of houses trying to figure out if or how to rebuild. And many residents had, even smaller amounts, but thousands of dollars of damage that they're still fighting with insurance companies, trying to figure out what FEMA will cover and paying out of pocket for everything that's not being covered. I was appointed a member of the Montpelier Commission on Recovery and Reliance that formed after last summer's devastating floods. And we're working on a range of projects, looking at things like how to better manage the land along our rivers. Could we build flood storage in town? What upstream and downstream restoration projects can we pursue to protect our community? How can we flood-proof the many buildings that are going to inevitably remain in harm's way? So Vermont communities are right now being put in the position of having to figure out these hard and expensive questions because of the climate crisis, and we need help and we need funding. As a parent, I'm also seeing the impacts of climate in numerous ways. Forest fire smoke last summer meant we had to keep our kids inside and had to cancel numerous planned activities. Summer camp, which we need for childcare, was canceled because of the flooding. For the first time ever this year, school has been closed numerous times due to water main breaks. Every time my kids play outside, we need to check for ticks and nonetheless have had to get them treated for numerous tick bites. That's time, pain, stress, and money coming out of our pockets and collectively is increasing our costs for our healthcare system. And, I could keep going, but just trying to make it real for like what it looks like to live in a climate change world and the many costs that we're experiencing. And we really can't afford to pay for these wide-ranging and significant costs alone, and we shouldn't have to, knowing that these large fossil fuel companies chose to continue selling products long after scientists had made clear how these products would cause exactly the type of property damage that communities all across Vermont are facing. They should help pay for communities to rebuild and take steps to make sure we're resilient to the evolving climatic conditions that increase our risk for ongoing and future damage. Either we continue with the status quo and pay for it ourselves as individuals and small businesses through local, state, and federal taxpayers, or we can pass this bill and ask the fossil fuel companies to help pay their fair share. This flood is the kind of thing that climate science says is going to happen more frequently and more intensely in the future. So having resources to respond and prepare our communities is so essential. Last fall, VCV co-hosted community conversations in Ludlow, Plainfield, and Johnson to hear from other flood-impacted residents. And it was just staggering to hear how many different needs and the variety of needs that people were identifying around the state. Another issue VCV has worked on for many years is cleaning up Lake Champlain and ensuring clean water for all. And we know the warming climate is making toxic cyanobacteria blooms worse, making our lakes and ponds unsafe for swimming during some of the hottest periods of summer. We also know that just this one July event dumped a massive amount of phosphorus into our lake. And this is a compounding tragedy considering how our lakes and ponds can be essential cooling resources for us and provide so many benefits for Vermont. I submitted to the committee assistant, so it should be on your website, but the Vermont Atlas of Disaster. And this was produced by Rebuild by Design, which is a group that formed after Superstorm Sandy with some federal resources and really are experts in kind of disaster impacts. And they analyzed the cost of climate change in Vermont. They found that Vermont has the 5th highest per capita costs of climate change. This study was looking at 2011 to 2021 and found that every single county has experienced at least 4 climate-related disasters during that 10-year period. The Atlas references a 2021 study by the University of Vermont, which predicted $5.29 billion in climate change-related flood damage along the Winooski River in the next century, affecting over 140,000 Vermonters. Of course, we just had a single $1 billion+ flood, so that now seems likely to be a massive underestimation of costs. As a local elected official, one thing I probably hear about more than any other is potholes, and you all drive around Montpelier, so you can see why. But in this Atlas of Disaster report, the authors identified that global warming exacerbates Vermont's historical seasonal thaw cycle, making potholes worse, more numerous, and more expensive to address. So it's the very large to the very small everyday things that impact Vermonters' lives and are real costs to our communities. The report also highlighted, for example, a $27 million federal disaster declaration from estimated crop losses in 10 counties of Vermont in 2020 due to severe drought conditions that climate scientists also link to global warming. As the state undertakes the resilience and adaptation strategic planning process laid out in the bill, we are definitely not starting from a blank page. Beyond many of the resources like the Atlas of Disaster, some of the reports that Ben referenced, the state can also build on the extensive work of our climate action plan produced by the Vermont Climate Council. That iterative planning process already identified a range of resilience and adaptation strategies, and that plan is getting updated with a new version due in July of 2025. So that will be another resource and another kind of set of experts for the state to lean into as it's looking at our adaptation and resilience needs to implement S259. Similarly, the state is actively working on the Vermont Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is supposed to be approved by FEMA this month. And this plan underscores many of the increasing threats and hazards that Vermont faces from climate change, such as inundation, flooding, and fluvial erosion, extreme heat. A quote from that report, the steering committee considered the probability of a plausibly significant extreme heat or prolonged hot weather event to be highly likely with major impacts to people. For wind, quote, it is likely that as climate change accelerates, we will see exacerbation of wind events such as hurricanes, tropical storms, and thunderstorms. For drought, quote, higher temperatures lead to increased rates of evaporation combined with dry periods between intense precipitation events will lead to increased dry conditions. The wet and dry extremes are expected to increase over time in Vermont. For infectious disease, quote, climate change can increase the range of diseases and their vectors and increase rates of infection. Warmer temperatures allow more diseases and their vectors to venture further north, where harsh winter temperatures previously inhibited expansion. There are invasive species impacts. There are landslide impacts. Quote, the anticipated increases in both frequency and magnitude of precipitation in Vermont will lead to alterations of hydrology and water availability. Increased flood, inundation, fluvial erosion, and subsequent landslide hazards will result in impacts to ecological and geomorphic integrity of river and floodplain systems and to the built environment. There are wildfire impacts as well. So to conclude, Vermont is already experiencing damage from climate change, and extensive research shows that these impacts are only expected to worsen over time. The state has a lot of resources to build on to do the work outlined in S259, and will have the support of entities like the Vermont Climate Council. Meanwhile, our communities will be facing more frequent and more intense disasters and will need to be investing in infrastructure that can be more resilient to these changing conditions, even as our local budgets are struggling. Seeing what this means firsthand in my own community, it's incredibly frustrating, challenging, and expensive. We know these large fossil fuel extracting and refining companies chose to sell their products and in fact increase production over time, despite knowing the impacts that would be caused by using their products. They're continuing to reap massive profits while Vermonters are left paying for the consequences. Asking them to pay their fair share for the damage their activities and products are causing is a common sense, rational, and essential step for Vermont to take. Thank you so much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks for your presentation, Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Just as someone who's been in the public works field, I'm curious with some of the things that jumped out at me, but one of the things which you mentioned was water main breaks, how climate change affects to create those.
Yeah, so I believe in the Atlas of Disaster. So the changing freeze-thaw cycles, they believe are exacerbating and making those more likely. And so as that changes, it's just putting increased pressure on those systems. So we've seen graphs in Montpelier, and it is increasing, and
Okay.
you know, it's been really expensive and really challenging for our public works department. And then we're dealing with those emergencies instead of trying to get our, keep on top of just the general maintenance. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And as someone who lives here part-time, I'm noticing a lot of sinkholes in random places and kind of frightening, which I'm guessing is kind of related to the same issue.
Yep.
The freeze-thaw cycle changing so much more often. Representative Smith.
Thank you. I'm trying to find in your presentation, and thank you for your time, said something about Lake Champlain.
Mhm.
I'd like to know what page it was on.
That was on page 3.
3.
Yeah. 3/4 of the way down the page.
If you were to rewrite this letter so that everybody in the state could see it, I would love to see you include not just Lake Champlain. We have a serious concern with Lake Memphremagog, and we're getting not as much attention as I think we deserve. So if you were to include all other lakes in Vermont, like Bomoseen and Caspian and Seymour, and that would have a lot more impact on my liking the letter. I mean, I appreciate what you've written here, but
Yeah.
there are other lakes.
Yeah, no, point well taken. I had seen data specifically on Lake Champlain and just the amount from the
Sure.
flooding that had happened in this watershed, that, all the sediment that had gone into it. And I hadn't seen specific data, so I didn't want to make any assertions, but certainly every lake has is experiencing impacts from this. And I agree with you, like it's statewide and making sure that that's
Well,
highlighted.
should you go to the press with something like this, add a few more lakes to that. I'd appreciate it.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Members have any further questions? I just want to appreciate that you are coming here as both an environmental advocate and a city councilor, and that is really to add a lot of good perspectives to the testimony today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Okay, members, you want to try to get to a place where we can move S213 today. We have a little bit of, I think, offline work to do on the amendment that's been proposed. And I don't think we have anything else to do unless folks have something they want to talk about before we adjourn till after the floor. All right, not seeing any. We will take a break and then we'll be back on right after the floor this afternoon.